Yes.
So while we're waiting for people to jump on at 10:15, the presentation will start at 10:15. Please feel free to chat. A lot of the Master Gardeners are jumping on from a business meeting that just finished. So use this time to visit a little bit, any members of the public. If you've got any questions at all about the Master Gardener program, feel free to jump in, ask a question, or put it in the chat box.
There must be a lot of people that don't want to be seen.
Well, and it keeps the system more stable, but those of us in the business meeting, of course, need to make a restroom stop and refill the water and coffee and and when the screen's up, then we just get the one strip.
And also change the sprinkler, move the sprinkler for watering.
True.
Hey, Jen, I read the article in the newspaper about the suffragettes. That was very lovely. That was nice.
Suffragists.
Yeah.
Suffragettes was a demeaning term that the Brits applied, and the UK women decided to go ahead with it, but the US people said absolutely not.
Ah.
That's the difference. So glad you're back, Susan.
Yeah. It really wasn't a big problem once I got the information. It's fairly simple, so.
Okay, good. Your green garden's working pretty well, right, Susan?
Yeah, it works.
Or your dry stem, I should say.
Monarch Watch works very well.
Yeah.
That catches the water spectacularly.
I was thinking of your dry bed at your house.
Yeah, that works too.
Yeah, good.
My dry bed empties out onto the prairie, so it catches it somewhat, but it's opening it up to a whole big area, and that's very effective then to stop the water.
Yeah.
What a beautiful rain garden.
Isn't it?
Massive.
I like the iris in the front.
Yeah.
That is,
I guess that's what that is.
yeah, it's it's a corporate campus outside of St. Louis. Merritt's is the name of the corporation. DJM Ecological Services installed it. And I thought it was just really pretty, really good example of a really large one that looks really nice.
Yeah.
You know what kind of trees are in there? What trees did they plant?
I have no idea. It looks like the one in the front might be a maple, but
When we went to St. Louis and toured, they had great lists, and I think they're available online, of plants for water gardens. There's a really extensive handout.
I think I came
Yeah.
across it.
Yeah, I actually have included a link to several of those at the end of this
Oh,
presentation.
thanks, Natasha.
Nice.
Okay, it is 10:15. So we're gonna go ahead and get started. My name is Sharon Ashworth. I'm the program manager for the Extension Master Gardeners, Douglas County. So welcome back to the Master Gardeners who have just finished their business meeting, and welcome to members of the public who have joined us. I'm just going to give a few Zoom tips before we get started here, before Chris introduces our speaker. First of all, if you have issues with unstable Zoom presentations, sometimes things will freeze up. It helps if you cancel your video. So make sure when the presentation starts to mute yourself, and then also stop your video on the lower left screen, and that might help with connection issues. Also, if you have multiple devices connected to your Wi-Fi, like I have my cell phone, I shut the Wi-Fi off on that, and that can sometimes help with your connection. So you can try that. Also, I'll be monitoring the chat box as we go. And so if you have questions during the presentation, please type them in the chat box. If it's appropriate, I might ask Natasha to pause for a moment and answer some questions. Otherwise, we will save some of the questions till the end, and you will also have an opportunity to just pop on audio at the end of the presentation and ask your question that way. But I will be monitoring it. Please let me know if I don't get to yours. We'll try to get to all the questions at the end of the presentation. So I'm going to turn it over to Chris now to introduce our speaker.
Good morning. Natasha, welcome. Natasha Thomas Groth is the Growing Center Manager for the Taylor Creek Restoration Nurseries in Baldwin. She has a lot of administrative duties on daily operations and customer service, works with vendors, and is responsible for scouting and collecting native seed for plant propagation, as well as overseeing all aspects of the plant production process. Natasha received her BS in wildlife biology from Baker and completed 1 year of grad studies in conservation biology at Emporia State. In this presentation, she will introduce rain gardens and the many ecological benefits. She'll briefly touch on the benefits of soil retention, water filtration and retention, pollinator habitat and food source, and increased biodiversity. She will provide detailed information regarding native plant species that are well suited for rain gardens and their individual ecological value. Here's Natasha.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. I hope you all are doing well during these unprecedented times. I will say this is the first time I've ever given a presentation over Zoom, so I don't know if it's going to be better or worse. They say to imagine everybody naked when you give a presentation, and that might actually be true right now. I don't know. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and get started. As Chris said, I'm the Growing Center Manager at Taylor Creek Restoration Nurseries in Baldwin City, Kansas. Let's see. So Taylor Creek is owned and operated by Applied Ecological Services. AES is a nationally recognized leader in ecological consulting, design, and restoration contracting. One of the many services that is provided by AES is wholesale native plants and seed. We have 2 nurseries that provide those services. One is located in Brodhead, Wisconsin, and largely services the upper Midwest area. And the other one is located outside of Baldwin City, Kansas, and we predominantly service the lower Midwest. Taylor Creek, part of working for Taylor Creek that's so awesome is that our philosophy and mission is exactly what anybody who cares about nature and the living world would want to have as their philosophy and mission. We work with nature, not against it. We are very dedicated to the genetic preservation and production of high quality native local genotype plants of the Midwest. And we love to share our information with everybody. We work with landscape architects, landscapers, government entities, other growers, and retail outlets to incorporate and bring native plants into all of the projects and outlets that are out there. I am going to be talking about rain gardens today, and I'm not exactly an expert on rain gardens. My area of expertise is more in the plants that you would put in a rain garden, but I am going to give a brief introduction to why people would want to have rain gardens. So if you look at these diagrams, the one on the upper left, and if I start talking too fast, somebody please slow me down. I tend to do that when I get nervous. So on the upper left is an example of the hydrologic cycle prior to urbanization and the increasing amounts of impervious surfaces. So prior to our industrial age and urbanization, there were no impervious surfaces. So when we had a rain event, the rain was either slowed by the topography and the vegetation, and then it was allowed to settle in natural wetlands and watersheds for it to be filtered and percolate into the groundwater. As we have ever increased and spread our urbanization, we continue to lay down more and more impervious surfaces. What happens with this is anytime there is a rain event, there is less topography. As most of you know, roofs, concrete, it's all designed to either be flat or run off into a stormwater basin. With the decreased amount of pervious surfaces, the water just flows faster and faster, picks up pollutants, and it carries it down into our natural water areas, causing pollution, flooding, overflowing of our stormwater systems, which can be a really big problem in larger cities. So some of the ways that we are mitigating for the increasing amounts of runoff is by creating bioswales, retention basins, and to a smaller scale, rain gardens. Rain gardens are really popular with homeowners. Some of the reasons that you might want a rain garden in your yard is if you have a naturally occurring low area that just continues to hold water, or you have a lot of, maybe you're on a farm and you've got a lot of runoff. So there are several reasons why you would want to have a rain garden. Erosion control, water retention, the roots of vegetation prevent and slow the runoff and the soil erosion. If you do have a wet area that's really hard to take care of, you can't really mow it, it looks kind of boring, you can turn it into something beautiful. They provide a lot of ecological function and aesthetics. The native vegetation that you use attracts beneficial pollinators. Those pollinators attract birds. Those birds attract, they drop stuff, they attract other animals. It's a really neat little bio community just right there in your yard. And they can be used for educational purposes as well. I know a lot of schools are putting them in. That way children can learn about the hydrological cycle and the biodiversity of a small scale ecosystem. These are just some examples of some formal looking urban rain gardens. And then up here is just kind of a diagram of, what did I do? Go back. A diagram of kind of the construction and the slope of a rain garden. Some things to consider when you're deciding where to locate your rain garden. You want to look at the topography of the area. You want to look for a place that there's natural slope and naturally occurring low areas. If you don't have that, you can dig and landscape. It's just a little more work. You want to take a look at your soil composition. You can take your soil in and have it tested, or you can do a simple test where you, I'm trying to remember how this goes, but you put your soil in a jar with some water and you shake it up and you let it sit for so many hours, and how it settles out will tell you the composition of your soil. You want to consider the size and the shape of your rain garden. The more runoff or impervious surfaces you have, the larger of a rain garden you want. The more clay you have in your soil, a larger retention area is what you want. The ideal rain garden with a small water basin would typically dry out within 2 days. Now, some people want a permanent standing body of water, like maybe they want a little koi pond or a little vegetative water pond. If you want to keep water down there and don't want it to slowly filtrate out, you can always add a liner or just add more clay to your soil. And then another thing to consider is the design. Do you want a natural looking, kind of mimicking a natural wetland, where you would use equal amounts of forbs and grasses to sedges, and it would be more of a, like the plants wouldn't be in a design necessarily, it'd look more natural and more randomly spaced. Or if you're doing this in your front yard of an HOA, you probably want a more formal, traditional, intentional manicured look. Those typically have mass plantings of one species, and they have more flowering plants than grasses or sedges. And these are some examples. Of course, this is a more formal, intentional looking rain garden. And then down here, this is just a large strip of prairie cordgrass that somebody put in between 2 parking areas where there's a lot of runoff. Okay. These are just some general rule of thumb guidelines for installing rain gardens. If your soil needs amending, you should probably use compost or find a better location. So some of the general guidelines: you should place your rain garden at least 10 feet from buildings, especially if you have a foundation or a basement, because they do channel and hold water. You don't want them up next to your basement or your foundation, where that's going to create much more expensive problems for you. Your size of your rain garden should be 20 to 30% of the surface area that's draining into the rain garden. And some of the links that I've provided at the end have workbooks where you basically just measure like your roof area or your parking lot area, whatever it is that is your impervious surface, and then there's a math equation that you can do to figure out how big your actual rain garden should be. You want to avoid soil compaction, because if the soil is compact, the water can't filter through. Avoid disturbing your tree roots. Trees are very, very important in the hydrologic cycle as well. It is not one of my areas of expertise, so I'm not going to get into that a lot. And then the more clay you have in your soil, as I mentioned before, equals less drainage. And then that means you're going to need a larger retention area or amendments. If you do have to amend your soil, in this area is not recommended to mix sand in, as because most of our soils have limestone, and sand, clay, and limestone will make concrete. And that doesn't do a very good job of letting water percolate through. This is an example of a percolation test you can do when you're installing your rain garden. Whoops, go back. So you want to dig a hole that's 12 foot deep by 6 inches in diameter, and you'll fill that hole with water and just let it stand until all the water is drained around and into the ground. And now you have saturated soil conditions. Then you're going to refill the empty hole, measure the depth of the water, and then every half hour for about 4 hours, go out and check how much is drained. And the adequate or ideal amount of drainage per hour is 1/4 of an inch to 1.5 inches. As I said, I'm not going to go into a great amount of detail on the logistics of building a rain garden, because that's not what I do. My focus on this presentation is going to be more on the plants, and that's my favorite part. So, of course, I recommend native plants because that's what I grow. It doesn't mean you can't use non-natives. They can be incorporated. They're just not typically as well adapted to the region's hydrologic conditions, heat, temperature fluctuations, insects, that kind of thing. Natives are, of course, adapted to our hydrology, soil, and weather conditions of this region. They're also tend to be more resilient to the insects that are in the region. They are an excellent host for native pollinators and habitat for our native insects, birds, smaller animals, larger animals. And their deep root systems help to stabilize the soil and allow for greater infiltration into the ground. This is probably a picture that you will all recognize of the nice deep roots of our typical prairie plants. And then I included this little diagram that's kind of how a natural runoff and retention basin would look. And I keep doing that. So you have your upper slope where you'd want your drier species. Lower slope can handle a little bit of wet, but prefer to be dry. And then you have your edge or seasonal inundation. These are your plants that are going to be in the water for a day or two, but can also handle being dried out for quite a while. And then your submergent, if you do want a rain garden where you're keeping the water around for a while, there are some native submergent species in this area that they look really nice, and there are outlets to find them. So I'm going to start with grasses. The grasses are usually good for borders and drier areas of your rain garden. The first one is Bouteloua curtipendula, or side oats grama. It tends to get 2 to 4 foot tall. It has that beautiful seed head on it in the fall. It blooms from August to October, and it is a mesic. And when I say mesic, that basically just means medium soil wetness. And it's mesic to dry, and it prefers full sun, but it will do okay in partial sun. And it's a great forage for birds and pollinators, and also provides good cover habitat. Almost everything that I'm going to show you guys is some kind of a pollinator host, or some kind of provides forage. It's just, they're all native, so it's kind of a given. So if I don't include that in there, that doesn't mean that it's not providing that function. It's just that I felt there was something else more interesting about it. The next one, and all of these plants that I'm going to give you, there are tons and tons and tons of natives that can be used in rain gardens. I am just going with the most popular, or the most aesthetically appealing, or just the better performing species that are out there. You can see up here is Panicum brigatum, or switchgrass. It gets 4 to 6 foot tall, so it's something that you would probably want as a backdrop. Its bloom time is from July to September, and it is also a mesic to dry species. It can handle being a little wetter than the side oats grama. It prefers full sun, can handle partial sun. It can be a little floppy, and there are 2 or 3 nativars out there that are available that tend to have a much more upright habitat. They're called Panicum heavy metal. There's Panicum Shenandoah is a really popular one, and then I think there's Cheyenne Sky, and there's one other that we grow that I'm not recalling off the top of my head, but they're kind of used more in formal plantings because they don't tend to flop as much. The next one is, of course, our Kansas state grass, little blue stem, or Schizachyrium scoparium. It gets 2 to 4 foot tall. It blooms July through September. Also a medium to dry species, preferring full sun, but can handle the shade. It's a very well-behaved grass. It forms these nice little clumps. They are beautiful in the fall with their color. It would be a great addition to a formal rain garden. And then this last one is river oats, or Chasmanthium latifolium. It gets 2 to 4 foot tall and blooms July through September. It is more of a wet to medium species, and it prefers shade, but it will do well in full sun. It has a really, really neat seed head, and this is one that I think is really cool to add to, like, if you're doing a garden at a school or something, especially for younger children, the tactile sensation of it, they really get a kick out of that. It does retain its seed head during the winter, so it would add a winter interest to your garden. However, it can be a very aggressive spreader, so it's one that you would have to keep track of and keep pruning back. Sedges and rushes. Sedges are becoming a really popular species, and especially for rain gardens. There are lots and lots of sedges out there. I am just going to present these top 4 that we typically are requested for bioswales, rain gardens, wetland mitigations. The first one is common burr sedge, or Carex grayi. It gets 1 to 3 foot tall and blooms May through August. It's a wet to mesic, so it prefers the wetter soils. It tolerates all sun conditions, but I typically find it when I'm out collecting seed growing in more of the shaded areas. It's a great forage for birds and pollinators. It has a really nice clumping habitat, and it has that really awesome big spiky seed head. So it's another one that if you have kids, they would really enjoy that one. Carex muscingummensis, or palm sedge. It is from 2 to 3 foot tall. It blooms in May to September. It doesn't really have a really spectacular seed head. And it is another wet to mesic species. It also likes full to partial sun. What's really interesting about it, and you can't see it in this picture that well, is that as it gets taller, the fronds actually kind of look like actual palm fronds. And it is a nice clump forming, so it makes a nice formal looking garden as well. The next one that is becoming more and more and more popular is white tinge sedge, or Carex albicans. It gets about 12 to 18 inches high. It blooms in May. It is a dry to mesic, so it would be good for your outer edges of your rain garden, especially if you have your trees or small shrubs around. It grows really well in the shade. It is somewhat of an evergreen sedge, so it stays green pretty much all year long, and it's a really nice clump former. A lot of people love it for their partially shaded areas for ground cover. And then the last one is brown fox sedge, or Carex vulpinoideae. It gets 2 to 3 foot tall, blooms May through July. It's a wet to mesic and full to partial. I typically find it more in full sun. Its seed head is really neat. It kind of looks like a little foxtail, and it's also clump forming. And all of these clump forming ones can really be standalone species if you want them to be. And then I just included 2 of the most common rushes. There are a lot of rushes out there, but these tend to be the one that are spec'd the most by landscapers and landscape architects. There's the common rush, Juncus effusus. It gets 2 to 3 foot tall. It blooms July through September, and it prefers wet conditions, but can handle some seasonal drying and full sun. It's a really nice vertical interest. They form a really nice clump. They spread by seed as well as rhizomatosely. So you might start out with just a few nice little clumps of it, and before you know it, you'll have some really big clumps. It can be aggressive if you have really wet area. If you're drying out though, it typically won't spread that bad. And then the next one is the dark green rush, or Scirpus atrivirans. It gets 3 to 6 foot tall. It blooms June through August. It prefers the wet to wet mesic. It can handle some drying out, but it prefers to have wet feet and full sun, and it's also a vertical interest and evergreen. Now I'm going to move on to the pretty parts, the forbs and wildflowers. This is what most people are interested, especially at the homeowner level. And like I said, I'm just giving a few examples. There are so many out there, and at the end of the slideshow, I have some links that will take you to different sites for rain gardens, and almost all of them include an exhaustive plant list of what you can use. So the first one is Amsonia illustris, or shining blue star. Oh, and I should mention also that the greatest majority of these species that I'm showing you are native to Northeast Kansas. Some of them are not. They're native to the western edges of Missouri, but they perform excellent in our area. Amsonia illustris is a blooming forb. It gets 2 to 3 feet tall, and it blooms in early spring. It prefers wet to mesic soil and full to part shade. If you're going to put it in a shaded area, it might flop, and you might have to cut it back early on or stake it in some way. One of the nice things about the Amsonias is when they senesce in the fall, they retain this really nice orange and yellow leaf, and so it looks really pretty throughout the year. There is another species that looks very, very similar to the shining blue star, which is the Ozark blue star, and honestly, I think the only difference between them is they say that the shining blue star has a shinier leaf. And there's also another illustris, which is Amsonia hubrichtii. I'm sorry, not another illustris, another Amsonia hubrichtii, which has more of a spindlier, skinnier leaf. And then the next one, swamp milkweed. Most people know about this guy. It's all over out in Douglas County. In fact, that picture was taken last night at Douglas County State Fishing Lake. Otherwise known as rose milkweed, I think. It is Asclepias incarnata. It gets 2 to 4 feet tall and blooms July through October. It's wet to wet mesic and it prefers full sun. This is an excellent source for butterflies and other pollinators, and of course it's a host for the monarch butterfly. The one on your left is rose turtlehead or Chelone obliqua. It gets 1 to 3 feet tall, blooms July through September, and prefers wet to wet mesic. And it is full to part shade. I typically see it more in like dappled shaded areas. Its little flower heads are the perfect shape for native bees to get down in there and get their nectar and pollen. It can get floppy in the shade. And then there is a similar species, Chelone glabra, which is white turtlehead, that I really, other than the color of the blooms, I don't know that there's much of a difference. I had to throw this big giant guy in here because he's one of my favorites. And he's a little out of order for the alphabetical order I was going with, but that's okay. So this is cut plant. You'll see it all over in Douglas County. It's Silphium perfoliatum. It can get up to 9 feet tall. It blooms July through September, and it does prefer wet to mesic soils, full sun. The reason it's called cut plant is because the leaves are opposite and they actually join around the stem and form a seal so that any rain that comes down gets held in the cup of those leaves for birds and insects to drink. I would not, if you're going to put this in your yard, you might want to put it as a backdrop species. And the next one is Joe Pyeweed or Eutrochium purpureum. It used to be part of the Eupatorium family, but they split it out. It gets 5 to 7 feet tall, blooms July through September, and again is wet to wet mesic and full to partial sun. It's a great nectar source for butterflies and pollinators. And again, as it's so tall, I would use it as a backdrop or a standalone species. Blue mist flower, it's a really pretty little one. It's Conoclinum celestinum. I think I said that right. It gets 2 to 4 foot tall and it is a fall bloomer. It prefers wet to mesic soils and full to part sun. It can be aggressive. So it is one that you either want to plant where you don't care if it takes off, or you're going to have to perform maintenance on it regularly, you know, pulling the seedlings, cutting it back, that kind of thing. Rattlesnake master is also a really awesome tactile and visual species. Regium yoncifolium gets about, that says 4 inches, that should say 4 feet tall. It blooms July through September, and it's a wet mesic to a dry mesic, so it can handle drier conditions. Likes full sun. It's got those nice spiky flower heads, and even though it doesn't attract your typical pollinators, a lot of the smaller native bees and insects love it, and it's also a host to the black swallowtail. And you can't see it very well by this picture, but it is actually in bloom, so those spiky ball heads just kind of get this little like tiny, tiny white little petal on them. And it's really pretty when you see it out on in the prairies or meadows. Then the next one is sneezeweed, Helenium autumnale. It gets 2 to 4 foot tall. It blooms August through October, and it prefers wet to mesic soils, full to part sun. It doesn't actually cause sneezing as it is insect pollinated, not wind pollinated. I'm not really sure why it got the name sneezeweed, but it is part of the sunflower family. It has an interesting seed head. Hibiscus. This one is Hibiscus laevis or halberd leaf rosemallow. They get 4 to 6 feet tall, bloom August through September, and they have a really nice, like giant dinner plate size bloom on them. They prefer wet to mesic soils and full sun. There is another species that's Laciocarpus that is very similar. I think the only difference between those two is the shape of the leaves. This halberd leaf rosemallow, supposedly the leaves are shaped like some 14th century sword or something. Next to it is the blue flag iris, Iris virginica shrevii. It gets 2 to 4 feet tall and blooms May to July, prefers wet soils but can handle drying out. Says full sun. I've seen it growing in shady areas. It's a gray iris. It does spread rhizomatously, but it also will shoot up these really tall, so the flower spikes are much taller than the plant itself, and it gets this really big seed head on it, which generally will pull that stalk down, and then the seed head bursts open. and that's how it self-seeds in the ground. Cardinal flower, Lobelia cardinalis. It is 2 to 4 foot tall and blooms July through September, prefers the wet to mesic soils and full to part sun. This is a great nectar source and attractant for hummingbirds. Anywhere you see cardinalis, you're probably going to see some hummingbirds. And there is a blue lobelia, which is just a little slightly smaller, and it blooms a little later, and of course its blooms are blue. The next one is foxglove beard tongue. I just love that name. It is Penstemon digitalis. It gets 2 to 3 feet tall and blooms April through June. Again, prefers the wet to mesic soils and full to part sun. It is actually also a hummingbird attractant. And you can see that these all have these similar shaped flower petals that are really inviting for bees and stuff to climb down inside of them. They make great pollinators. The next one is obedient plant, which is Physostasia virginiana. It gets 2 to 4 foot tall, blooms June through September, and prefers the wet to mesic soils and full to part shade. It too can get floppy in the shade. If that happens, you just cut it back, or you might want to stake it. The reason it's called obedient plant is because you can actually touch the individual flowers and direct them in another direction, and they will stay that way like they're on a hinge. Rudbeckia subtomentosa is sweet cone flower. We have a lot of this growing around Douglas County in the wetter areas. You can't see it from this picture, but it actually has more flower heads to it than your typical black-eye Susans. It'll get really prolific flower heads, so it likes to be dead. If you want to keep it blooming, deadheading is a good idea on this one. It gets 3 to 5 foot tall and blooms July through October, and again prefers the wet to mesic soils. Another really popular one, New England aster. Symphyotrichum novaangliae. It gets 2 to 6 feet tall. I think I've even seen it taller around here, and it is a late bloomer. It provides some fall color, blooms August through October, and it is a wet to mesic, but I have seen it perform fairly well in drier soils as well, and full to part sun. It's an excellent later nectar source, again, a later eye catcher in the fall. Next to it is Veronicastrum virginicum, or Culver's root. This one kind of is intriguing to me. I've seen it in the wild, and I've never seen it super tall, but all the literature says it can actually get up to 7 feet tall, but that the majority of that is actually its flower spike. It blooms June through August, again wet to mesic, and requires full to part shade. It can also get floppy in the shade. I saw a stand of this growing out at Aiken Prairie this year for the first time. I was really excited about that. And then the following one is Liatris pycnostachya, or prairie blazing star. It gets 2 to 5 foot tall, blooms July through September, prefers the wet to mesic soils, loves the full sun. Butterflies love the liatrices, but one of the downfalls to the liatrices is they're a corm or a bulb, and they do not tolerate wet soils in the winter. They will rot out. So if this is something you want to include, you're going to want to make sure that in the winter, it's an upper area, that in the winter it doesn't get a lot of soil or moisture in the soil staying on it. That is the end of the plants. Like I said, there are so many more you can use, but I just thought I would highlight the most popular ones for rain gardens. I would like to thank these people up here under the acknowledgements: Scott Woodbury with Shaw Nature Reserve, Rhonda Burnett with the Missouri Department of Conservation, and Carol David with NPF and Grow Native for loaning me some of the photos in this presentation and some of the educational materials. Like us at AES, all of these people love to share their knowledge, and they're great resources. I didn't touch really on construction of rain gardens, but I did include some names of some locally owned landscape designers and installers that I know in the area that do use native plants. There's Green Thumb Landscaping in Lawrence, Julie Denning. I know she has used native plants in a lot of her installs. Low Maintenance Landscape in Lawrence, Kansas, as well as Native Lands, Courtney Masterson out of Lawrence, Kansas. And then in the Kansas City area, there is Down to Earth Services and Habitat Architects. I am familiar with all of these because they purchase plants from us for their installs. I'm sure there are others out there. I'm just not as familiar with them. And then on the right-hand side of the screen are several links to several great resources for rain gardens, native plants, all kinds of stuff. And some of them you can even, you know, like the Missouri Botanical Gardens has so much information in it. You could probably get answers to everything you ever wanted to know. And that's it. I will take questions and comments now.
Well, if I could, I'm going to jump in with the chat box and then invite everybody else to either type some more questions into the chat box or pipe up on audio. But one question I imagine a lot of people are thinking about is about mosquitoes. That's a very common question we get with rain gardens. So
Yeah.
Any advice on mosquitoes?
So, like I said, your typical rain garden is supposed to dry out within 2 days. Mosquitoes need 2 to 3 weeks for their larvae to develop, for their life cycle. So if you're doing a rain garden that doesn't actually include a permanent body of water, mosquitoes aren't typically an issue. In addition to that, they kind of tend to attract birds and stuff that will eat them. If you do want a rain garden that you keep a permanent body of water with, they just recommend you use mosquito dunks in them.
Okay, can you explain what the mosquito, do you know what the mosquito dunks are? I know I've seen them in the hardware store.
Yeah,
Little round disc.
they're just little round disc, and I assume I haven't researched what's in them. My guess would be that they interrupt the life cycle somehow.
Okay. Another question and comment. Let's see, we've got Panicum Shenandoah. If you go to the Lead Center, you can go and see what that looks like in the garden in front of the Lead Center. There's the Panicum Shenandoah, which I believe is a bit smaller than the native switchgrass.
It's a little more
another one,
well-behaved.
I know you,
Go ahead.
yeah. There is, I know you went through some of the requirements for each of the perennials, but I know a common thing when you're talking about people in town, smaller properties, we have, especially in Lawrence here, we have a lot of shade, and we're always looking for shorter, well-behaved perennials for the rain garden. Can you give us maybe your top 2 or 3 that for the smaller homeowner who can't have anything really big, has some shade for in town? What would be your top 2 or 3 recommendations?
There are, there's several. Depending on if you're wanting shorter, so I can talk about some ground covers as well as some shorter kind of that, have the flowering attraction. There's, and I'm not really good with common names, you'll have to forgive me on that, but there's Pacra obovata, which is commonly known as groundsel or squawweed. It does really well, performs really well in the shade. It's a perennial. It shoots up these, its flower spike is probably 2 to 3 times the size of the actual vegetation, and they're these bright yellow little mini flowers. Another really neat one is heuchera. I think there's a lot of cultivars of the heuchera plants. They do really well in the shade. I'm trying to think what their common name is, and I can't. That's terrible. I'm sorry.
I believe it's coral bells.
Yes, coral bells. There you go. So we do have the native heuchera. It's Richardsonii, and then I've seen that growing around here in Douglas County, but also native to kind of the western Missouri area is the heuchera parviflora, and then there's a heuchera americana. And they do really well in the shade, and they're really well behaved. There is robin's plantain, which is a Rigeron pulchellus that kind of mimics the Shasta daisy, but is much smaller. There's the antenarias, the field pussy toes, and I can't think of the one that likes shade. It's Antenaria plantaginifolia. It tends to do better in the shade than the Antenaria neglecta does. But those are really neat. They have these nice, really low growing fuzzy leaves, and they shoot up these flower spikes that look like a kitten's paws. So they're a really interesting visual attraction, and they're smaller and do really well in the shade. Let me think, what else? Of course, the Carex albicans does great. It doesn't get really big. It's well behaved. Carex blanda is another Carex species that does well in shade and that's fairly well behaved. I think there's any other smaller. That's the thing with being prairie plants being, you know, the predominant thing around here. They're all giant.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and oftentimes the ones that will tolerate some shade do flop if they get too much shade, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
So another information here, the mosquito dunks you mentioned, they're actually soaked with BT, the Bacillus thuringiensis. Thanks, Kevin, for that. That's the big mosquito dunk ingredient, and it is safe for plants. I do know that. There is a question here. Someone writing in that says she has an area that is wet with the spring rains, but is now quite dry. Do these plants survive in this dryness? Because I don't want to water them the rest of the summer.
So these plants are ones that can handle the drying out. That's why they make really good rain garden plants. If you're not doing a rain garden and you're just planting them, probably the first year or so, you're going to have to water them to get them established. The drier plants, once they're established, they should handle drying out. But these are more designed, you know, these plants that I put on here are more for the seasonal wet and dry. So yeah, they can handle extended periods of drying out, but the ones that say, you know, mesic to dry. But I wouldn't just put them, I guess what I'm saying is if you're not planning on you watering at all after they're established, you would probably want to find more species that are more on the mesic to dry side of requirements that can handle the drying out for long periods of time.
Okay, I also want to invite anybody who wants to chime in over audio with a question rather than type it in the chat box.
Natasha, I just mentioned in terms of another
How this works is people just have to jump in. You have to unmute yourself and jump in.
Natasha, when you were talking about part shade, shorter plants, Nepeta, catmint seems to work okay.
What did you say it was?
Nepeta?
Yes, yeah.
Catmint?
Yeah, they do well. And the conoclinum isn't as, I mean, I've seen it stay pretty short too, the mistflower.
Oh, okay.
And I think like Teucrium, the wild germanders, they're smaller and they can handle the shade too.
I turned off your screen sharing, Natasha, just for a moment so people could jump on and ask questions. But if you need to go back and refer to one of your slides, please go ahead and share again.
Okay.
Let's see, another recommendation, small phlox subulata and glabrinum are good for shady areas. So there's a couple recommendations in the chat box if you want to go look at that.
Yeah, and I didn't include any of the phloxes, but there's there's the garden phlox, which gets pretty big, but there are some smaller prairie phloxes that can handle the shade and they don't get real tall either.
Can they print out a list of, because I don't know how the spelling is, a lot of those shade things.
So if you go to those links that are on my last slide, which I believe this is being recorded.
Yes.
Several of those links, like the Kansas Wildflowers and Grasses and some of the actual rain garden links, they have plant lists with all of that information.
Thank you.
Super.
And I am more than willing to I can give you guys my email, and anybody that wants to email me with questions is welcome to as well.
Wonderful.
Great. One question I have that I've noticed about the changing climate with the types of rains we get is rain gardens are going to become increasingly important, as you said, in the landscape for managing stormwater. But we get a lot of rain really fast now sometimes. And so some of the areas that I'm concerned about are ones that also have to deal with rushing water. And we've certainly had calls into the extension office about people's backyards just becoming rivers. Do you have any suggestions for an area where there might be actually periods of flowing water?
So that kind of dips into the actual design and construction of the rain garden. You know, so your rain garden starts at your downspout or wherever your runoff is, depending, you know, I've seen a lot of really cool ideas, but if your downspout comes all the way to the ground, you can actually bury a perforated pipe, and then that leads into your bioswale. And your bioswale is your like meandering little ditch area, and people include stone and plants in those to slow the flow as it's running off before it actually reaches the retention area with the berm on it. So you can design your bioswale area to slow down the flow of the water. Some other things I've seen are people capturing the water as it flows off and holding it like in rain barrels or whatever, and then letting it slowly flow out of those containment units.
Great, thank you. I have a question. I will be posting the recording. I'm putting up the link to the Douglas County Extension website. And as soon as I am able to get the recording and edit it a bit, I will be posting it on the Douglas County website. And I put the link up in the chat box.
And I did include your guys' link on my page of links as well.
Great.
Any other questions?
Natasha, I want to especially thank you. I love native plants. So this is a new take on rain gardens and native plants. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And I don't know how much you guys work with like elementary schools and stuff, but these are great projects for smaller kids to learn about the hydrologic cycle and water runoff and why it's so important to have plants, and you can make it really fun.
Great, thank you. And there's lots of thank yous in the chat box. So I think we all certainly learned a lot, and I've got a list for my own project. So I'm finally going to try one.
Yeah, and those some of those links actually like include, like I said, step-by-step instructions. They give you like, you can even draw your own map and all kinds of stuff.
Great. And so thank you everybody for attending. Like I said, I will be posting this in the coming days on the K-State website, so you can always go back and look at this information. It's always a lot to take in when we're talking about various plant recommendations, and certainly the spellings and pronunciations and whatnot. So it'll all be available to you on the K-State website, and I welcome everyone back in September for our program. Chris, can you give a highlight of our September program?
Yes, the September program is by Katie Kingridge Page. She's Associate Dean of Architecture at KSU, and she's doing restorative landscaping. So it'll fit very nicely with this presentation.
Yes, great. Thank you, and hope to see you all in September then. Have a great day, everyone.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha.